and he expressed an interest in being one of the contributors. And I know he's given many talks. He's been a resident of South Perth for many years, 35 years. More importantly, he's been a member of the City of South Perth Historical Association since 2014. He's now very much on the speaking circuit. He gives talks around Perth, and I'm sure we're going to find it really very interesting. I'm looking forward to an interesting talk on early days of Perth and the Perth Hills, railways, timber railways and orchards. And Greg has said that he's very happy to accept questions and discussions at the end. Pleased to welcome our new speaker, so please give a warm welcome to Greg.
Thanks a lot, Keith. Thanks to everyone for coming out on a winter's night. So welcome to this talk on early days of Perth and Perth Hills, timber, railways and orchards. The reason we are here today, or tonight, is thanks to my Aunt Dorothy, who married Eric Price, whose father was Thomas Price, who last year I discovered had lived in the Perth Hills and helped to pioneer the orchard industry in Western Australia. Last March, I met Tom Price, grandson of Thomas, who kindly gave me tours around his family orchard and lent me several books on the rich history of the Perth Hills, which has inspired tonight's talk. A talk which I gave last September to the City of South Perth Historical Society, of which I'm a member. I realise some of you here may be familiar with much of what I have to say. Hopefully I will be able to give you a few new insights. The early days for the Whadjuk Noongar Aboriginal people begins when, from the dreaming, the rainbow serpent called the Woggle created the waterways and landforms around Perth. Evidence shows that the first people came to the Upper Swan at least 38,000 years ago, probably longer, as material at Wadjumup or Rottnest Island has been dated to 50,000 years ago. As shown in this map, from discussions with the Aboriginal Yagan in 1832, the Whadjuk Noongar were divided into groups which each had their own identified lands. Early uses of trees included the making of boomerangs, shields, spears, spear throwers, and a variety of different sticks used for digging, throwing, clapping, and sending messages. Impact on the land was minimal and always done in a sustainable way. All that changed with the arrival of Europeans. The Noongar land was taken over, and extraordinary numbers of tall trees that had stood for hundreds of years would, over a few short decades, be cut down for uses in the new colony and around the world. Due to very favourable reports and persuasion by James Stirling, following his trip to the Swan River in 1827, the Colonial Office appointed Stirling to establish a new British colony in 1829. The new colony on the Swan River was given the name Perth, thanks to a suggestion by Sir George Murray, Secretary of State for War and the Colonies. Perth was Murray's birthplace in Scotland. Murray Street in our city and two Murray Rivers are named after him. In this painting of the foundation ceremony in 1829, near the present site of the Perth Town Hall, Mrs. Helena Dance, wife of Captain William Dance, commander of HMS Sulphur, is shown holding an axe and about to make the first cut into a tree. Immediately to the right of her is an axeman waiting to complete the task. Here is the symbolism of British changes to the natural landscape that were to come. At the ceremony, a Western Australian she-oak tree was in fact felled and used to make a sewing box for the Governor's wife, Ellen Stirling. The first years of the Swan River colony were a desperate struggle for survival. Feisty Eliza Shaw, who arrived in 1830, wrote, "That man who reported this land to be good deserves hanging 9 times over." With the exception of the fertile alluvial soils found around Guildford, the Upper Swan and Kelmscott, much of the land was quite sandy and unsuitable for agriculture. Difficulties in the colony were many, including limited supplies, scarce medical facilities, lack of good land, flies, dire food shortages, and trouble with the Aborigines. News of problems stemmed the inflow of new arrivals and increased the outflow of people to other colonies. Poor anchorage near Fremantle deterred some ships. Early travel along the Swan River was problematic, with rock bars, mud flats and tidal shallows to contend with. Travel overland was long via dirt bush tracks and often hindered by sandy terrain. By 1849, the population of WA was less than 5,000, of which there were only about 1,400 in the area around Perth. Helping the young colony to grow, the timber industry was one of the first industries to be established in WA. In 1853, large-scale timber cutting began in the southwest. Then in the 1860s, commercial timber cutting started in the Perth Hills. In the early years, the quality of the tree Eucalyptus marginata was not well known. It was first referred to as Swan River mahogany. The name Jarrah would come into use, gaining a reputation of being a dense wood, its long straight trunks of beautifully grained termite-resistant timber, making it valuable for uses, including roofs, bridges, wharf piles, roads, railway sleepers, as well as flooring and furniture. Here 3 photos, the first using an axe to cut the big Jarrah trees, the second moving a log to a whim with a bullock team, and the third of men as they used the exhausting pit saw method on one of the large fell Jarrah trees. From about the mid-1860s, many were glad to see the saw pit method being replaced by steam engines driving circular saws.
Excuse me, is that thing a Jarrah tree?
Yes.
Whoa, that's huge.
The photo's actually from the Kalamunda Historical Village, if you're interested.
I've never seen a Jarrah tree that big.
You're not allowed to grow any bigger.
After a decade and a half of meagre growth, it was realised that without a larger workforce, the economy could not develop. Following lobbying from major landholders and the vote from a public meeting in 1849, Perth marked its 21st birthday by becoming a penal settlement. From 1850, for the next 18 years, there was an influx of nearly 10,000 convicts from Britain who came on 43 convict ship voyages. In 1868, the last convict ship arrived, being the frigate Hougoumont. This influx significantly changed the social and economic dynamics of the colony. The convicts at relatively low cost were involved in the construction of roads and public works, many of which were involved in the timber industry. One good example was the North Fremantle Bridge built by convicts in the mid-1860s. Providing much needed resources and food for the young Perth colony was help from the Perth Hills by exploiting the timber resources, followed by building railways and growing orchards. Early pioneers in these industries, about whom I'll now tell you, included Benjamin Mason, Francis Bird, Edward Keane, the White brothers, Edward and Lionel, the Wright brothers, Arthur and James, and Thomas Price. Two of the first well-known pioneers in the timber industry were Mason and Bird. Benjamin Mason was born in England. In 1831, aged 3, he arrived with his parents in Perth. By 1859, aged 31, Benjamin Mason had become a businessman and Perth councillor. Benjamin rode on horseback into the Perth Hills and was inspired by the potential of the tall timber as the colony expanded. In 1860, he set up his first timber mill in the hills near the corner of Lesmurdie Road and Welshpool Road. Bullocks and horses were used to cart the timber down bush tracks to the Canning River. In 1869, Francis Bird, aged 23, arrived at Fremantle on the sailing ship Bridgetown. The tall jarrahs and the Darling Ranges took his breath away. In answer to an advertisement and being able to provide £25,000 capital from his father, this young architect soon entered into partnership with Benjamin Mason, who by this time had relocated the mill to the Carmel timber settlement. From 1871, in exchange for the granting of a timber concession for 100,000 acres, work began on constructing the Mason and Timber Railway, which, as shown on the map, extended for about 15 kilometres from the Perth Hills, whereby horses were used to pull the huge log trains along the rail track to Mason's Landing on the Canning River at Cannington. Initially the tracks were wooden. Later they were capped with iron. It was opened by Governor Weld in early 1872. In 1871, Francis Bird married Maud Earnshaw. In 1874, they settled near Mason's Landing at Woodlows, a home built from some of the finest jarrah produced at the mill. The Woodlows homestead at Cannington was restored in the late 1970s and is normally open to the public on the first and third Sunday of each month, from March to November. As you enter the homestead, you may, as I did, meet Sarah, being the great-great-granddaughter of Francis Bird. Not far away in Station Street is the Francis Bird Park, which is a memorial bust statue of Francis Bird. Following financial difficulties, by 1877 Francis Bird had relinquished his milling interests and settled in Perth to practice as an architect. From 1883 to 1884 he served as chief government architect. By 1889 he moved with his family to Albany and took up residence at Strawberry Hill, where he remained for the rest of his life. Pictured on this slide is the plaque at Mason's Landing, acknowledging that in 1861 Benjamin Mason was a pioneer of the jarrah timber industry. As already mentioned, timber was taken from the Perth Hill mill at Carmel via the Mason and Bird Railway to Mason's Landing at Cannington. From Mason's Landing it was then taken by flat-bottom barge along the Canning and Swan rivers to the port of Fremantle. To overcome the problem of barges being grounded at low tide, in 1866 convicts were used to construct a fence in the Canning River from jarrah poles, casuarina saplings, local swamp she-oak and brushwood to form a barrier to help stop the mud from refilling the convict-dug channel for the barges. Records indicate that there are about 200 to 300 convicts there at different times. As shown on the slide, a photo of the convict fence appeared in the Sunday Times in 1919. The illustration shows a clear representation of its construction, whereby the top plank allowed the bargemen to walk along and pull the barges. Remnants of the fence, which extended in the river at least from Shelley Bridge to Salters Point, are still visible today. Today, a large part of the Canning River, used to transport the Mason and Bird timber, can be seen by taking the Wadjup to Gabalooju walk shown on the slide. From the Riverton Bridge at one end to Yagan Reserve at the other end, the 6.6 kilometre walk takes at least about an hour and a half. The walk has been established thanks to the considerable efforts of Susan Harris, who's with us here tonight. Thanks, Susan. Who has set up more than 30 information signs along the way, showcasing the natural and cultural heritage of the area. Information includes history of the convict fence, also lots about the ecosystems along the foreshore, and more than 60 species of local and migratory birds in the area. The Wadjup to Gabalooju walk also has a Facebook page, including many photographs. Timber from the Mason and Bird mills has been used in many of Perth's early constructions. In 1865, timber was supplied by Mason's Mill for the causeway. Also the North Fremantle Bridge is shown in the photo, which opened in 1867 and lasted over 72 years until the next replacement opened in 1939. There were also 1,000 telegraph poles for the South Australian government. In 1867, Mason tendered for timber for the banquet room roof, at Government House, and in 1869 for the roof of the Perth Town Hall, being Australia's only town hall built by convict labour. In 1871, Mason Bird provided timber for the Fremantle Lunatic Asylum, today the Fremantle Arts Centre, also built using convict labour. And in 1873 it was Mason Bird Timber which built the first section of the Fremantle Ocean Jetty. Later known as the Long Jetty, it was demolished in 1921 due to the creation of the Fremantle Harbour. Another use for the Jarrah was as railway sleepers, including in India and for the London Underground Railway, which still runs on WA Jarrah sleepers. At about the same time as the convict fence was being built by convicts in the Canning River, from about 1866, convicts were cutting down 300-year-old Jarrah trees and using Jarrah blocks to give stability and pave the road to Guildford, now known as the Great Eastern Highway. In 2012, during roadworks, the old Jarrah blocks were found near the Belmont Road, where the Belmont Road intersects the Great Eastern Highway. The Jarrah blocks were known as Hampton's cheeses, named after the austere-looking WA Governor, Dr. John Hampton, who gave orders for construction of the road based on a method used in Canada. As the governor of a colony in a debt crisis, Hampton introduced strict cost-cutting measures, including using convict labour wherever possible. Convicts cut the Jarrah tree trunks into sliced discs, about 30 centimetres thick, for about a 20-kilometre stretch of the road to Guildford, as well as other roads such as Stirling Highway, Albany Highway and Wanneroo Road. These Jarrah slices were positioned alongside each other, and the space between them compacted either with soil or crushed limestone. The Jarrah slices became known as Hampton's cheeses because their round shape was reminiscent of round cheeses. In 2012, several were transferred to the City of Belmont's impressive new museum for public display. Jarrah bricks or blocks and Jarrah planks were also used in the construction of roads in Perth and Fremantle. The first photo, taken in 1901, shows the laying of Jarrah bricks used to pave Hay Street. Here, Jarrah bricks were used to complete the road surface after the tram lines were installed. The next photo upper right, taken in 1905, is laying Jarrah cube blocks and tram track on High Street in Fremantle. According to the records, there were 250,000 Jarrah cubes laid on the Fremantle streets by 1903. This was also the era when millers at Yarloop in WA had won a contract to provide 1 million Jarrah blocks to pave the streets of London. The other two photos, showing the making of the Jarrah Plank Road in Osborne Park and the Plank Road to City Beach, now known as Oceanic Drive, which was completed in 1918. The two-track plank road was laid directly onto the sand. Each track was 3 planks wide. The planks were 5 centimetres thick, 20 centimetres wide, and were laid longitudinally and held in place by dock spikes. Some of the Jarrah plank roads were later tarred over to help prevent tyre punctures caused by splinters in the wood. Here, some very early history of the Perth Hills and surprise connections with India. The Perth Hills are part of the Darling Ranges, named in 1827 by Captain James Stirling after New South Wales Governor-General Sir Ralph Darling, to whom he was reporting about prospects for a new colony on the Swan River. To gain extra favour, Mount Eliza in Kings Park was named after the Governor's young wife Eliza. As to the Darling Ranges, now known as the Darling Scarp, this is an escarpment formed as a result of a geological fault more than 2,500 million years ago. The Darling Fault is exposed for over 1,000 kilometres, from near Shark Bay in the north to near Albany in the south. An information sign next to the Lesmurdie Falls is quite revealing. About the Gondwanan connection it says, the Darling Scarp and Fault demarcate the separation 135 million years ago of Western Australia and India, from when they were once fused together as part of the supercontinent of Gondwana. Reference is made to the fluctuating global sea levels due to the polar caps expanding and contracting. Apparently about 200,000 years ago, the Darling Scarp was a line of cliffs with the sea, with beaches and bays below. This meant Perth City, and where we are tonight, would have all been underwater, thus explaining why we can see seashells along the South Perth foreshore. After the WA Darling Scarp separated from India millions of years ago, connections were again rekindled thanks to timber from the Perth Hills. In 1868, Benjamin Mason obtained a contract for 20,000 Jarrah railway sleepers for the Indian Railways. Alas, in the 1870s, a shipment of timber from the Mason and Bird's mill going to Calcutta was sunk in a storm. It was not insured, as insurance was unheard of in those days. This contributed to the collapse in the partnership of Mason and Bird in 1873. Other shipments of Jarrah railway sleepers did make it to India, contributing to the country's vast railway network, today notorious for its overcrowding. The map on the slide was prepared in 1877 and shows the choice of railway routes being considered between Fremantle and Guildford. Essentially, the route was along the Swan River, either on the northern side or southern side, which considered the line diverting at Canning Bridge to follow the line of the present-day freeway along the Melville foreshore, across the Narrows to Perth, then on to Guildford. The northern route won the day. Otherwise, we would have had a Narrows Bridge 80 years earlier than when finally built in 1959. The northern route had been supported by James Thomas, Director of Public Works. Bitterly disappointed was Thomas Brown, given the nickname Satan because of his black hair and saturnine or gloomy temperament. Some might remember he was the guy in 1879 who leased the old mill and briefly turned it into a hotel called the Altar Gardens, with picnic grounds. Thomas Brown prominently advocated the southern route and was personally attacked for his former status as a convict. The Eastern Railway via the northern route opened in 1881 when trains began operating between Fremantle to Perth. The photo shows Perth railway station with the train heading east in about 1882. The link from Perth to Guildford was completed in 1885. Here, an amazing photo in 1885 from the top of the Perth Town Hall, showing Barrack Street, Murray Street, Wellington Street, and a circle, the Perth railway station. The photo is actually part of a 360-degree panorama that can be seen on a website for the Historical Panoramas project, being a collaboration between Curtin University and the State Library of WA. With the advent of the new Northern Railway route to Guildford, all transportation on the Canning River from Mason's Landing now ceased. The industries south of the river were relatively unsupported. This big disappointment to Benjamin Mason added to his problems. In 1882, facing bankruptcy, Benjamin Mason's mill business closed, with much of the machinery being eventually sold to the Canning Mills. In 1878, the partnership of Keane and White railway contractors was formed. Edward Keane was a capable engineer. His father-in-law was Abraham White, who brought his two sons, Lionel and Edward, into the business. In 1881, Keane and White tendered for the construction of the second stage of the Eastern Railway, linking Guildford to Chidlow's Well. The contract was won by James William Wright, who enlisted Keane and White. In the Mount Helena area, Abraham White constructed a mill, with the main purpose of providing railway sleepers. His young son Lionel White built up the mill and kept it working to capacity with a staff of about 30 men. James Wright encountered many difficulties in constructing the railway and was unable to carry on the work for the original tender price. Edward Keane renegotiated the contract, took over the work, and with most of the surveying work done by Edward White, completed many railway contracts in the years to follow, including Chidlow's to York, York to Beverley, Spencer's Brook to Northam, and Bunbury to Noyanup, to name a few. It is said Edward Keane organised the building of 500 miles of railways in the state, also various public buildings such as the Fremantle Town Hall. By 1890, Edward Keane had become member for Geraldton in the Legislative Assembly. In 1891 and 1892 he was Mayor of Perth. He also became Chairman of the Metropolitan Water Board. Edward Keane had become a man with considerable influence. As shown on the map, Edward and his wife Lila lived on the Swan River at a place which became known as Keane's Point. Their home here was eventually bequeathed to the Royal Freshwater Bay Yacht Club for use as a clubhouse. In 1891, Edward Keane and Lionel White set about to build the Upper Darling Range Railway, as it would later be known, to serve the new mill run by the Canning Jarrah Timber Company, which they had formed. A contract entered into with the WA colonial government stipulated that the line should be the absolute property of the contractor until the end of 1899, after which the government would have the right to purchase it at £1,000 per mile. The railway, surveyed by Lionel's brother Edward White, stretched for over 19 miles, from Helena Vale, later called Midland Junction, via the 14 stopping places listed to Canning Timber Station. Given many of the places had no shelter for passengers, they could not justify the title of stations. Between Ridge Hill and Gooseberry Hill, the line ascended the steep 751 feet escarpment by a series of zigzags. The railway line was an engineering feat and built it in record time of 11 months, a lot less than the railway currently being built to the Perth Airport. In the years to follow, many local residents complained, frustrated by non-existent or unreliable schedules and little seating for passengers. The railway was so totally unreliable that the orchard growers constructed their own road to Guildford. A pressure group called the Upper Darling Range Railway League was formed to lobby the government. After prevaricating for several years, in 1903, the line to Pickering Brook was taken over by the WA Government Railways. In 1910, the government took over the line to Canning Mills. In 1912, the line was extended to Carragullen. Roads were being built to accommodate the arrival of the motorcar and the establishment of a bus service. The railway operated until 1949, when it became uneconomical because the sawmills had virtually closed and the local orchardists had their own vehicles to take produce to market. In 1952, the Upper Darling Range railway line was dismantled, having given service for 58 years. This slide is a map from a book called The History of Pickering Brook, which was published in 2019. The railway to the Upper Darling Range assisted in the 1891 completion of the Victoria Reservoir to supply water to the city of Perth. The map shows the railway line from Carmel to Carragullen, as well as another side line to the Bartons Mill, where there's a photograph of the locomotive pulling carriages of timber. In addition to the Bartons Mill, the map shows location of the Mason and Bird Mill, the Canning Mills and the Smales Mill. As timber close to the main mills was cut out, spot mills was established up to 15 miles away to provide a continuing flow of pre-cut logs back to the main mills for processing. An extensive bush railway extended southeast from Bartons Mill and eventually totalled 86 kilometres. Given we have already covered the Mason and Bird story, on the next two slides I'll tell you a little bit more about the Canning Mills and Bartons Mill. With the take-up of the timber concession of Benjamin Mason, in 1891 Edward Keane and his brother-in-law Lionel White formed the Canning Jarrah Timber Company, the Canning Mills. Within 2 years the population of Canning Mills was 400, growing into a large settlement with inn, 2 churches, resident doctor, hospital, post office, general store and a school. The company employed 150 men and 40 children attended the school. The slide shows pictures from the Canning Mills, including 4-wheeled whims and the famous 2-wheeled whim called Daisy Bell, which with its massive 9-foot diameter wheels was used to move the giant Jarrah tree logs. As to the locomotives, the Canning Jarrah Timber Company had ordered 4 locomotives from Hudswell Clark of Leeds, UK. They became known as the Canning locomotives and were named after the company directors, being Coates, Noyes, Morgan and Mayo. The Coates was the first to arrive in 1893. By 1902, the Canning Jarrah Timber Company was taken over by Millers Carey and Jarrah Company, and all the locomotives and rolling stock were used throughout their timber operations in the southwest of WA. Millers, which formed as an amalgamation of a multitude of the main WA timber companies, became virtually the whole timber industry in the state and one of the biggest timber centres in the world. Millers was eventually absorbed by Bunnings in 1983. Another of the main mills was Barton's Mill. The photographs of Barton's show the Whims, the mill, a loaded log train and a bullock team in action. John Alexander Barton was the foreman of a mill at Donnybrook, southeast of Bunbury, in the period up to at least 1901. For a few years he was foreman of a mill in Denmark and shifted up the bush line until in 1907 Barton set up his own small mill about 3 kilometres east of Pickering Brook. In 1908, Barton died aged only 42, having been struck on the head by a join on a belt driving the saws. After his death, the place continued to be known as Barton's Mill. This is another mill of many that would also be taken over by Millers. Now we move on to the arrival of Thomas Price and his impact on the orchard industry. Thomas's wife was the first to arrive in Australia. In 1882, 8-year-old Emily Rogers, with her family, arrived from Plymouth to Sydney Harbour. They saw the spectacular sight of the Royal Mail ship Austral, which had sunk in 52 feet of water due to a weight imbalance of coal. The Austral was one of the world's largest vessels, being a steamship also fitted with sail. Little did young Emily know that this was the ship that would be refloated and bring her future husband, Thomas Price, from England to WA in 1891. By 1892, the Rogers family had moved from Sydney to Perth, then in 1897 to Guildford, where Emily met Thomas. In 1899, Thomas Price, aged 34, married Emily, aged 25. When Thomas Price died in 1955, aged 89, he would be remembered as the champion apple grower of this state. President of the WA Fruit Growers Association, James Martin, wrote that Thomas Price had become a legend during his lifetime, and this cannot be said of many men in any walk of life. I'll tell you more about Thomas in the slides to come. When Captain James Stirling founded Perth along the Upper Swan River, where he was to take up land, he named both Woodbridge and Guildford after similar adjoining Woodbridge and Guildford in Surrey, where his wife's family lived. In 1883, Charles Harper and his wife Fanny purchased land formerly owned by Stirling, and 2 years later finished construction of a large family home known as Woodbridge House. The mill managed by Lionel White cut all of the timber for Woodbridge House. The architects were James William Wright and his brother Arthur Bridge Wright, who was the first chairman of the South Perth Road Board. As to Charles Harper, he served in both houses of the WA Parliament, was part owner of the Western Australian newspaper and started the Western Mail. In 1895, Charles established a school in the house for his children and those of neighbours. A small single-storied school building was erected in 1900. It was purchased a decade later by the Church of England and went on to become Guildford Grammar School. In 1891, when Thomas Price arrived in WA, the population in Perth had been recorded as 8,447. Horticulture was generally in a pitiable condition. With his experience from England in the propagation of plants, Thomas Price eventually secured employment as a gardener with Charles Harper at Woodbridge. Harper had planted a 5-acre orchard with oranges, peaches, plums, nectarines, apples, pears, quinces and other fruits. The photo on the slide shows the orchard at Woodbridge in 1901. Harper and Price had a vision of a grapefruit growing in the colony. As depicted in the statue outside the Perth Mint in 1892, near what is now Coolgardie, William Ford and Arthur Bailey are credited with the discovery of the first significant gold find in WA. Following the discovery of gold, the rapid increase in population gave an urgency to fruit growing and an opportunity for nurserymen. Taking advantage of the new opportunities for growth in the orchard industry was Charles Harper and Thomas Price. During the 1890s, a partnership was established to trade under the name of C. Harper and T. Price. Harper was to provide the land and make his orchard and plant available, while Price was to be responsible for everything else. Here is a rare copy, thanks to Tom Price, of the cover from a 20-page catalogue of fruit trees and rooted vines cultivated for sale by C. Harper and T. Price, Tom's grandfather, from Woodbridge Nurseries at Guildford. As shown on the slide, pages 3 to 6 list detailed descriptions of 62 varieties of apples, with colourful names such as Beauty of Bath, French Crab and Northern Spy. The catalogue also includes 28 varieties of pears, 32 of peaches, 24 of plums, as well as 37 varieties of rooted vines and 69 varieties of roses. In 1891, Lionel White, the mill manager, and his brother Edward White, the railway surveyor, together with Edward Smith, formed the partnership Smith and White Brothers and acquired a 100-acre block with good water and soil in the Perth Hills. The heavily timbered country needed clearing. It would become known as the Illawarra Orchard, the name coming from the place where the White Brothers had lived in South Australia. There was an initial planting of mainly oranges in 5 acres. By 1898, the absentee owners had 22 acres of fruit trees with 9 different fruits and 35 varieties of apples and numerous varieties of pears. The demands of the Illawarra Orchard were formidable. Being in a remote area, which in 1912 would be called Carragullen, meaning Red Gully in Aboriginal dialect, clearing and ploughing the timberland was difficult, exhausting and sometimes hazardous. To meet the ongoing demands, Thomas Price, with his growing reputation as a nurseryman, was invited to become managing partner in the Illawarra Orchard Company. The potential of the property influenced Price, and in 1899 he invested £500 and acquired a quarter share in the enterprise. Thomas and his young wife Emily moved to the property. It was a big adjustment, especially for Emily. In this remote bush location, initially Thomas wished he had never come. In due course, his persistence and ethic of thoroughness and efficiency would yield very good results. At the turn of the 19th to 20th century, the Illawarra Orchard was an isolated place. The nearest neighbour was a mile away. In 1899, Western Australian women were among the first in the world to obtain the right to vote. Emily Price was not deterred from the discomfort of a 3.5-mile buggy ride over an indescribably rough bush track to reach the polling booth at Canning Mills. After years of dedicated work, the Illawarra Orchard became renowned for its apples. In 1908, at the Franco-British exhibition in London, the diploma for gold medal was awarded to T. Price, Western Australia, for apples. In 1912, at the Royal International Horticultural Exhibition at the Chelsea Gardens in London, the diploma of honour was awarded to Illawarra Orchard Company. Many more awards were to be won. For a decade and a half, the orchard was the largest producer in WA of the Granny Smith apple. In 1930, Thomas Price retired and handed over management of Illawarra to his sons Hector and Wilfred. Thomas continued as chairman of directors. His involvement in marketing continued until his death in 1955. Thomas Price was recognised as one of the ablest orchardists in Western Australia. A few notable events from the history included that in 1914, Illawarra was the first orchard in the state to install an on-site cold store for giving picked fruit a longer life. In 1923, Illawarra had the largest single consignment of fruit drawn by horses, being 2,267 cases for one boat, with haulage taking 6 days. Clyde, who was in the photograph with Margaret Price, was the last horse who passed away in 1953, having notably hauled 20,000 cases of fruit in one season. Over the many years, improvements at Illawarra have included sprinkler irrigation from a dam and later use of microjet sprays. Machines have replaced grading by hand, and trellises, mobile picking and pruning platforms have replaced ladders. Challenges still include finding good staff, unpredictable and extreme weather, hail, drought, extreme heat and damage from various birds and pests, including oriental fruit moth, plague thrip, wood rotting fungi, Mediterranean fruit fly, Myriadal dimple bug and the looper caterpillar. The rich legacy left by Thomas Price is today being very well continued by his grandson Tom Price, son of Hector, who has been full owner and manager since 1980. In the 1980s, the Illawarra orchard was one of the first to produce and participate in the success of the Pink Lady apple. The property is now 200 acres, of which about 70 acres is a sustainable producing orchard consisting of about 35,000 trees, being plums, peaches, nectarines and some apples. As I found out over several visits, Tom has an amazing detailed lifetime understanding experience of every aspect of managing and pioneering developments in the orchard industry. He has a very keen interest in the history of the area, with not only many photographic displays of Illawarra and the early pioneers from other orchards, but also an impressive room whose four walls depict the route of the Upper Darling Range railway line, with a collection of many old photos. Having now enjoyed several visits to the Illawarra orchard since last March, I was very pleased to discover from Tom that the ashes of his Uncle Eric and my Aunt Dorothy, in accordance with their wishes, were many years ago on the property scattered to the wind by Tom and his daughter Melissa. Certainly, it's a wonderful final resting place. Given the opportunities of providing for a growing population with good water and soil, and with the successes of those such as Thomas Price at Illawarra Orchard leading the way, many early settlers commenced orchards in the Perth Hills. On the slide is a photo of Edward and Mary Owen. In 1894, Edward Owen moved from a tailing business in North Fremantle to relocate near the site of the Mason and Bird sawmill onto a property to be known as Rosedale. Edward commenced his orchard by initially clearing 1 acre without assistance. By 1911, with an entire holding of 315 acres, he had cleared 13 acres as garden and orchard, with apples and pears being predominant. In due course, Edward's grandson Ray Owen, and then his sons, helped develop and manage the family orchard. Ray Owen worked for the Agricultural Department until 1944. Ray served many years in the WA Parliament, for 3 years to 1947 and 12 years to 1962. Amongst other things, Ray was instrumental in the formation of the export stone fruit pool to investigate and develop the export market for stone fruit, particularly to Singapore and the UK. Ray's many contributions to the industry were recognised in 2020 when he was inducted in the WA Agricultural Hall of Fame. Tony Vincenti of Weeyamolla Orchard in Carmel has been involved in the fruit growing industry all his life, and is agent for manufacturers of machinery and equipment for orchardists and growers. In 2015, the Vincenti family, friends of the Owens family, purchased 175 acres, being 4 titles of the Owens blocks, which were then included as part of their ownership of the Weeyamolla Orchard. Here, photos of Achille Giamelli, also known as Alex, and 2 of his sons, Peter and John. In 1936, Alex was only 16 years old when he left Italy for Australia, in response to a call to help his uncle Don Marchetti's fruit and vegetable business in Pickering Brook. Alex worked long hours and quickly settled into the Australian lifestyle. In 1941 he married Rose and had 4 children. After his uncle Dom died in an accident, Alex developed the properties and in 1950 established in the district the first fruit exporting business to Singapore, Hong Kong and the United Kingdom. In the mid-60s, Alex established the family business of A.G. Amelia and Sons on Canning Road, Carmel. He became the youngest board member at Wesfarmers. In 1970, Alex passed away from a heart condition, aged only 49 years old. The G. Amelia family has remained as orchardists in the area. In 2002, Alex's son John, a highly respected grower, was awarded a medal for his personal contribution and involvement in the fruit industry of Western Australia. In 2010, John died aged 68. John's daughter Libby Carruthers continues the family tradition. Listed on the slide are 15 family names of early pioneers in the Perth Hills orchards, whose work is carried on into the 3rd and 4th generations. Here is a slide I thought worth sharing, being the result of a Google search for orchards in the Perth Hills. The 14 listed orchards stretch from Wollaston, Carmel and Pickering Brook down via Carragullen to Roleystone and Bedfordale. I've been told this is perhaps only about a quarter of the orchards, as many don't come up on the Google search. With their particular seasons, there are now on offer at least 15 different fruits, being apples, apricots, avocados, cherries, lemons, loquats, mandarins, nectarines, oranges, peaches, pears, persimmons, plums, pluots and pomegranates. At this point, I would be remiss if I omitted mentioning the citrus orchards which were able to tap into the supply of water along the Canning River. There were oranges, lemons, grapefruit and mandarin. Orchards were mainly located near the river in Maddington and Gosnells, but also in the less fertile soils of Kenwick and East Cannington. Largest of these was run by the Wilkinson family, whose homestead, built in 1912 for John Wilkinson and his family, is now a museum in Gosnells. On display there is an operating fruit grader and in the garden a few remaining citrus trees. The Wilkinson orchard, which operated commercially until 1960, became one of the largest citrus producing properties in the state. At the height of production, the property produced per year up to 100 tonnes of lemons and between 5,000 and 6,000 cases of mainly Navel and Valencia oranges. Some fruit went to factories such as Cotty's, Flamers, Faldings and Kim's to be made into drinks, essential oils, essences, jams and candy peel. Here at the Kalamunda History Village, the story has been told well about timber, railways and orchards. It's wonderful to see the old Kalamunda railway station with a Scottish-built locomotive. The station here was originally called Sturk's Landing, named after the first permanent European settlers in the area, Frederick and Elizabeth Sturk, who arrived in 1881. It was the only station on the line with a raised platform. The name Kalamunda came into effect in 1901 and is understood to have been derived from the name of the local Aboriginal leader called Monday and from the Noongar language meaning home in the forest. Other village features of note include seeing a whim used for moving logs and the saw pit. As another reminder of the impact of European settlement, the village here includes the unlucky old Jarrah stump, which stood on the Kalamunda corner of Williams and Elizabeth Streets for 400 years, until it died when a car crashed into it in the 1980s. One of the main features of the Kalamunda History Village is the orchard shed, showing the development of the orchard industry in the district. Shown on the slide are photos of the orchard hand tools and a fruit grader used until the 1970s on the Dell Orchard in Pauls Valley, east of Gooseberry Hill. On the display behind the fruit grader is a list of the main different types of fruits of the district. For example, there are at least 9 different types of plums, 9 different types of apples, and 10 different types of peaches. The orchard shed also includes a display showing the Illawarra story and photos of local orchards, with a model of the Arlington rotary bin fruit grader designed by Jack and M.B. Thomas in Kalamunda. The photos show grading and packing export fruit at Illawarra in 1933 and the Illawarra orchard lorry pulled by two Clydesdale draft horses. With the purchase of the first tractor in 1927, the horses were gradually retired. So that's almost the end of my talk. Whilst there is undoubtedly much history I haven't covered in this relatively short talk, hopefully I have shown you some more on the formative early days of Perth and the Perth Hills. In conclusion, I thought I would leave you with this amusing picture I found in the museum at the Royal Western Australian Historical Society at 49 Broadway, Nedlands. The picture is a lithograph by S. Stoutshanks published in 1829, depicting the Duke of Wellington, then Prime Minister of England, on a wild goose flight to the Swan River. The caricature reflected heavy criticism at the time against the British government regarding the Swan River colony. Although the colony had difficult years to begin with, thanks to the persistence of early settlers, the convicts involved with infrastructure projects, the boom from gold in the 1890s, and thanks to the extraordinary contributions of the early pioneers, including those involved with timber, railways and orchards, we now know that the wild goose chase was worth all the efforts. As to references for this talk, in addition to a few excerpts from Cecil Florey's book Peninsula City in South Perth, I need to acknowledge the very informative websites from the Pickering Brook Heritage Group, and in particular the book called The History of Pickering Brook and the Surrounding Area by Gordon Freegard, which covers very well the history of timber, railways and orchards in the Perth Hills. More interesting information on orchards came from publications by Eric Price, Hector Price and Tom Price, being the direct descendants of the legendary orchard grower Thomas Price. So if anyone has any questions or would like information from this talk, I'm happy to help. Also feel free to make any comments. Thank you.